talk that I'm going to give to you today is about price theory, which is at the core of economics. And it's, it seems weird for an economist to be working on a book to try to talk about price theory and recreate price theory to people. It might seem strange for you, especially students who might have been exposed to the economic way of thinking, to think in terms of that price theory is something we have to emphasize. But I'll just use as a piece of evidence that the University of Chicago, for the last over a decade, holds a camp for PhD students every summer, introducing them to price theory. If they're presumably getting price theory at Harvard and MIT and Stanford and Princeton and Berkeley, why would Chicago need to have them come and live in Chicago in the dead of summer to learn price theory? The reason is that modern technical economics has disregarded the teachings of price theory. The reason why they disregarded the teachings of price theory isn't that there aren't prices in their models. They have prices, but the prices don't do anything. They merely represent something. All right? Because the prices are not guiding individual action. There's no profits that are luring actors into a market. There's no losses that are disciplining a market, disciplining actors in the market. They're not active. In the textbook, Economic Way of Thinking, when we talk about the model of competition, right, we make a distinction between competition as a verb and competition as a noun. Right? If competition is a noun, it's a state of affairs. If a competition is a verb, it's a set of activities. What we want to do is activities. We want to study activities because this is why prices play such an important role in our society, is because they guide us in our actions, in our activities. All right? The spread between prices is what lures us to want to, buy low and sell high. And we rearrange our behavior when it turns out that what we buy high and sell low. We say, can't keep doing that. And that leads us to do what? Another activity. So the fact that in equilibrium, when everything is all balanced, price equals marginal cost, that's an important aspect of to learn. But it's not what prices do. It's what they represent. So the whole premise of price theory is bounded on the idea that what we study in economics is exchange and the institutions within which exchange takes place. So I was saying to the class that I just talked to before, this is actually commonsensical from anyone who read Adam Smith or David Hume, right? If you read the beginning of The Wealth of Nations, you get that the greatest improvement to mankind is due to, increases in specialization. This, by the way, was core idea for Manuel Ayau, right? It's the division of labor, Ricardo's law of association. It's the reason why he championed Mises so strongly, is because it was in Mises's writings that he found the best description of Ricardo's law of association and comparative advantage. All right. So what in Adam Smith, in the early readings, we learn about the greatest improvements are from the division of labor. And we also learn that the division of labor gets refined because we expand the array of exchanges. It's man's propensity to truck, barter, and exchange. And so we economists, we study exchange and the institutions within which exchange takes place. What are those institutions? Those institutions are property, contract, and consent. This is what Hume told us in his treatise of human nature. Without stability of possession, without transference of those possessions by consent, and without the keeping of promises, you cannot get social order. You can't get civil society. And all you have to do to realize the strength of Hume's point is to do the thought experiment in your own head. What would life be like if there was no stability of possession, transference was through violence, and no one kept promises. Again, we already know what that is. Thomas Hobbes told us that. Life would be nasty, brutish, and short. You had Deirdre McCloskey here a couple weeks ago. One of the things that Deirdre used to do, right? So her bourgeois trilogy is trying to explain the hockey stick of human progress. The book that Rosalino and I did are trying to explain the hockey stick. One of the things that Deirdre used to do is she would stand on a stage and she would walk across the stage and she'd go, ooh, whoop. She in her most sort of acting days, there was a TV commercial when I was a kid. It was for the Fig Newton, which is a cookie. And the Fig Newton guy, when he would introduce the fig, he would put his arm up and then kick his leg back. And so she used to do that. She'd go, whoop, like that. What's she trying to get you to understand? This right here. What generated that? Right? What generated that? And what generated that was the wide-scale escape from the Hobbesian jungle, right? How many here, just by show of hands, have ever seen the video on YouTube or in your class or whatever by Hans Riesling called 200 Countries Over 200 Years in 4 Minutes? It's a BBC video, and it's done for data visualization. What Hans Riesling is trying to show you is how you can do data visualization, take stats, and turn it into effective data visualization. But what he chooses is to explain the hockey stick. And what he points out is for most of human history, we were living in a world which was poor and sick. And it's only very recently that we live in a world that's healthy and wealthy. It's only the first time in human history in 2015 that less than 10% of the world's population is living under $2 a day. Let that sink in. When I was an economics student, when I was sitting in the equivalent of your seat right now, that number was 40% of the world's population was living in extreme poverty. All right, what's the difference between that? Expansion of globalization. What led to globalization? A lot of technological innovations, obviously, that lowered the cost of transporting goods and whatnot, but also security of property, transference of those properties through consent, and the keeping of promises. Property, contract, and consent. So what we have is we have a price system operating within a social structure determined by the political, legal, and social and cultural mores of a society. And then the market works within that. It's never disembodied from that. It's always embedded inside of that. And then we look at the ways in which prices serve their role. So what is it that prices do? Well, prices, first off, give us ex ante information. Right? The terms of exchange are communicated to us in a posted price. And we look at that and we think to ourselves how that relates to the way that we're going to make choices when we face scarcity and trade-offs. What are the costs and benefits of us engaging in this activity or that activity? And the price is giving us useful information. If a price goes up, we know that the good is become relatively more scarce. If the price goes down, it's relatively more abundant. So if it goes up, we want to economize on it. If it goes down, we can utilize more of it. So that gives us ex ante information before we act about how to do things. But then what else does a price do? What did I say before? Buy low, sell high, or buy high, sell low. It gives us ex post information. We guide it, went this way, and then we need a feedback mechanism that tells us whether or not how we were guided was the right direction or the wrong direction. Right? In English, a U.S. culture of the 1960s and 70s, when someone made a bad mistake in business, they used to smack their head and they'd say, should have had a V8. V8's a little like juice thing. And they wanted you to have, the tomato juice with all the, good things in it. And you should have had that rather than wasting your money on like a milkshake or something like that, right? So it should have had a V8. What is that implying? What we're doing is we're reorienting our behavior based on what? On the knowledge that we're given ex post. So the market system gives us ex ante information. It gives us ex post information. And precisely because we have ex ante expectations and ex post realizations, it leads us to change and discover new ways to do things. All right. And that's the power of the price system. It's one of constant adaptation and adjustment to the changing circumstances of the life around us. We need to have that constant flow of that. So it generates the discovery, the use, and dissemination of the useful knowledge that's required for us to achieve productive specialization and peaceful social cooperation through exchange. In short, it's the foundation of how we end up by producing more with less rather than less with more. Less with more with less. Economics is a very basic, simple science. It's not simple-minded, but it's simple. It's basic common sense reasoning applied. You know, if you want to just boil it down, forget any kind of schools of thought or anything like that, it's really just the following thing. We live in a world of scarcity. Scarcity implies trade-offs. All right? Trade-offs are tricky, and therefore they need to be negotiated. The tools in commercial society that allow us to negotiate our trade-offs are going to be property, prices, and profit and loss. If we are not in commercial society, we still face trade-offs. We are still going to need tools to help us negotiate the trade-offs. The question is, how effective does that institutional arrangement allow us to pursue productive specialization and peaceful social cooperation? That's the intellectual horse race that's going on between the market and non-market decision making. All right? And so we have to, so the discovery, use, dissemination of the knowledge that is embedded within the economic system. So we can talk about in the economic sphere, we can talk about underlying variables that we hold, which is tastes, technology, and resource availability. And we can talk about induced variables of the market, which is prices, profit and loss statements, and the pattern of resource ownership. And when those things perfectly dovetail with one another, that is, the induced variables line up perfectly with the underlying variables, prices at that point are going to be a sufficient statistic for market clearing. They are going to be an incentive wrapped in a signal. They are going to be price equal to marginal costs, which it means that the full opportunity costs of exchange are taken into account. Therefore, we'll have exchange efficiency. And the minimum point on the average cost curve will mean that we'll achieve production efficiency. So what prices represent when the induced variables and the underlying variables line up perfectly is captured in your model of perfect competition. But the prices are doing no work there. That's why they can be called a parameter. Right? Everyone is a price taker, not a price maker. In the economic way of thinking, following from Armin Alchian, this is one of the innovations in education we try to do. Our whole book is grounded on the idea that we are not price takers, but price makers or price searchers. So in the book, when you read through it, you remember the Ed Sykes trying to figure out how to price the tickets, at the college movie theater, right? He's trying to find that price. That aspect of finding the price is big. The model that has us where everyone is a price taker suffers a fundamental flaw. And that flaw was recognized by Kenneth Arrow, who was one of the major developers of that model, but also, a more recent economist, Avnish Dixit, who's a great technical economist. And that is, in a world where everyone is a price taker, how is it that prices ever adjust to clear the market? So you're a price taker. There's a freeze in Florida, so the oranges are now frozen, right? So that means you did what to the supply of oranges? You shifted it backwards. What happens? You get a new P and Q vector, which would clear that market. How did that price ever change if everyone just treated prices as parametric? You need to have someone intervening, making the price. Prices have to be doing something, not just merely representing something. Early on in my intellectual development, I read an article by a guy named Kenneth Boulding, who fortunately later became my teacher as well. But I read it before I had him as a teacher. And it's called After Samuelson, Who Needs Smith? And he makes an argument that we all do. And then he makes an argument that that Smith is part of our extended present because all of the ideas from Smith haven't been scientifically exhausted in the moderns. And he makes an argument of what he calls mainline economics. So that always dawned on me. Okay, so all right, cool, mainline economics. So then I'm here at UFM. Giancarlo invited my colleague Chris Coyne and I to be here for 2 weeks. And we stayed here and we, met with everyone, talked about a lot of different things. And so we walked back and forth between these buildings and I kept on going past that mural. But one of the things that I kept on thinking to myself was, what gets you up on that wall and what gets you disqualified? Because not every economist since the School of Salamanca is on that wall. A lot of economists that didn't make it up there. And what was that characteristic? And that characteristic to me, I'm not saying this was in the mindset of the people who put the mural, but that characteristic to me was that these are individuals who believe in the invisible hand, but derive the invisible hand from the institutional environment in which rational agents act. So we square the rational choice postulate with the invisible hand proposition, but via the power of institutions of property, contract, and consent. And therefore, we can't do economics unless we talk about that institutional framework and its impact on the exchange behavior that individuals engage in. So we're always doing comparative institutions. So Armin Alchin, in his famous paper on uncertainty and economics and evolution, calls this, the market is always evolving towards a solution. Evolution towards a solution. Buchanan, in What Should Economists Do?, in which he makes the strong argument for that economists need to follow the exchange paradigm rather than the allocation paradigm, what he argues is that the market and also us as individuals are always in the process of becoming. Right? We have aspirations to be something other than what we currently are while you're in school. Right? You want to be something in what Buchanan calls artifactual man. Man wants liberty to become the man he wants to become. That means you're going to become something other than what you currently are. You're aspiring beings. So besides, I know that many of you have read Human Action and whatnot. So besides what it means to be a purposeful human actor and the way Mises discusses that in the first 100 pages of Human Action and the role that uncertainty plays in it, his purposeful actor is an aspiring actor. They have imagination. They're dreaming about an alternative world and then they're trying to put it into action. That's what mankind is. We're not passive responders. Okay, we're not just this, what Mises contrasts in the beginning is automatons. The economics that talks about what prices represent is economics of automatons. The economics that talks about what prices do, that's about active agents, actors. My colleague, Rosalino Candela, who I wrote this book with, but also comes down here, and many of you know him. He has a great article which he goes to the Latin root of the term imperfect. Because many of you, if you're in standard economics classes or you're using standard economics as a foil, you'll hear about a concept called market failure and imperfect markets. And so what Rosalino asks is, what's the root of the word imperfect? And the root of the word imperfect in Latin is actually much more along the lines of Alchin and Buchanan. It's in the process of becoming. Right? It's not that I'm comparing an ideal and then this is a failure against it. It's that I'm moving in this other direction. Many of you, if you Austrian, classes may have been introduced to Israel Kirzner. In fact, I'm sure you have been. Israel Kirzner's Entrepreneurial Theory of the Market. It's Kerzner who makes this distinction between the induced and underlying variables. And the agitation in the market, whenever the induced and the underlying don't add up, represents a profit opportunity for the entrepreneur who can recognize the spread. And that's what drives the market. So the entrepreneur is the driving force in the market. So I want you to think about a sentence from Matt Ridley, the great science writer, Matt Ridley, in his book, How Innovation Works. He says, innovation is the child of freedom and the parent of prosperity. Innovation is the child of freedom and the parent of prosperity. What drives both parts of that sentence? Again, I think if you thought about that, it would teach you a ton about economics. Because why is it that innovation comes from freedom? Is because we unlock the creative powers of a free civilization. And that creative powers is in you. It's in you recognizing opportunities for betterment. It's you having the imagination to think that you could build something better than what currently is being built. That only happens because of freedom. All of you know probably the story of Manuel Ayau. He wanted to build things. He was educated in North America. He came back home to build. He's a civil engineer. And what did he learn? No building. And he asked why. And that led him down this path. It's because the institutions were such, they were constraining the building of all the individuals. They were not unlocking the creative powers of a free civilization. They were locking it up. And so it had to be unlocked. What was his genius was he first thought the way to unlock that is through public policy. And then he realized that public policy can only be successful if you create the intellectual understanding that underlies it. So he started a university. This is a key aspect. The title of my book that I'm working on price theory with Rosalino is called Price Theory as Prophylactic. It's a phrase that comes from Henry Simons, the great Chicago economist who taught price theory to generations of economists at Chicago. And he argues that price theory, we were motivated by two of his quotes, but one of his quotes is, price theory is most useful as a prophylactic against popular fallacies. Right? So when you learn economics, one of the things that really good economics teaches you is to have a BS detector. And you're able to pop through the fallacies that so much occupy our space. So this Kerzner aspect of the agitation of the market and the entrepreneur is the driving force of the market, that's going to have to be a key thing. So what's this book structure look like? So the first chapter is really, in a large extent, what I just sort of talked to you about. It's titled Price Theory is Dead, Long Live Price Theory. Okay? And it sort of makes this argument about why we need price theory now more than ever, right? To be able to wrestle with the dilemmas of the world that we face today. The second chapter is called 120 Cases of Market Failure. This is derivative of an essay by Deirdre McCloskey, which identified the 120 cases that are employed by economists to talk about market failure. And so we want to, in our view, most of these market failure ideas are a consequence of popular fallacies, zero-sum thinking, other kind of things like that. So, but in order for us to disabuse them, we have to give them their day. So we're trying to state them in the strongest way possible so that we're not setting up a weak enemy, we're steel manning our opponent. So a great set of advice to all of you intellectually is to look up Daniel Dennett's Rules of Intellectual Engagement. So what Dennett argues in that is that you first should state the position of your opponent so well that your opponent would say to you, that's better than I would put it. Right? That's better than I would put it. And then what you proceed to do is from that, then provide the criticism imminently, not transcendent, but the imminent criticism of their approach that shows that their goal cannot be achieved given their means. And then that's how you can argue and be effective in the debate, which is different from straw manning an argument and then providing transcendent criticism. All right? And so what you want to do as a scientist is make your task harder, not easier. This cuts against us because what science does is give us parsimony, right? We want parsimonious explanations, right? That's one of the big benefits of science. It's Occam's razor, right? We want parsimony. But in engagement, the parsimonious answer might not be the most robust answer. So we want, among the parsimonious stories, the ones that are most robust. And that's what Rosalino and I are trying to work through. So that leads us to a comparative analysis of price theoretic responses to the 120 categories of market failure. And so in the next chapter of the book, we divide 3 different responses. The economists that are telling us that we have market failures simply have engaged in a category error because they didn't draw the cost curves the right way. So the simplest story to tell on this is to invoke a perfect competition model comparison with a monopoly model. So if you can remember in your head, when someone draws a monopoly diagram, you have a P and Q set of vectors, and then what you do is you draw a horizontal curve, right, which is going to be your marginal cost curve, and then you draw a downward sloping demand curve, okay, which is the marginal revenue. And at the point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, you would be pricing at the competitive price. When you get monopoly power, you restrict output and you raise the price so that you get a monopoly price and a monopoly output. Reduce output, raise price. Create what? Deadweight loss, market failure. Right? Because gains from trade that could have been made now are not being made. Okay? So what Armin Alchin asked to students is, hey, why is it that the monopolist doesn't perfectly price discriminate and therefore capture all of the surplus? Rather than having the deadweight loss, the monopolist just gets it as a pure transfer to them. Why would they not do that? The argument is that the transaction costs of doing that are too high. So Alchin asks, transaction costs. The transaction cost is a cost associated with the next additional exchange. That's the point of the right? It's a transaction, and it's a cost, and the costs are on the margin, so it's the next exchange. So you drawing that vertical, horizontal marginal cost curve leaves on the table all these marginal costs that are unaccounted for. So let's add them into the story. Now, all of a sudden, what happens to that marginal cost curve? And what do I have? Price equals marginal revenue, competitive price. You made a conceptual error in the way that you identified the deadweight loss. That's an argument that Armin Alchin makes. That's an argument that George Stigler makes. It's an argument that Gary Becker makes. If you go online and listen to the Chicago price theory lectures, which you can do, you can take the seminar that they teach on Chicago price theory. The very first lecture by Kevin Murphy is on compensating differentials, which is why it is that you choose different occupations at time. And then why is it that you choose this one or that one? It's because you have to take into account all the different costs, and that will explain the behavior. If I endogenize all the costs, then that explains the behavior. And that's a very strong answer to the market failure people. But it's not very persuasive to them. So a great theorist like Joe Stiglitz, in his book, Whither Socialism, which was his Vixell lectures, can say Chicago economics is well-funded, but not well-founded. Now, that's a refuge of a scoundrel. Okay, so I'm not excusing him. But why would he say that? Why do other people like Paul Krugman or anyone else believe that? It's because internal to the model, they don't believe that the Chicagoans have taken seriously their critique. They have done a Jedi mind trick. There are no externalities. There are no informational asymmetries. Right? There are no market structure problems. And so to them, we just end up by being divides in a debate that can't be reconciled. They dominate. That's why price theory is dead, because they think price theory is that. So they teach you Maskell, Winston, and Green. Behavioral economics is baked into the system. Imperfect information baked into the system. Imperfect market structures baked into the system. When you get that, you can't get the invisible hand in their model. You get instead what Stiglitz calls the palsied hand. Stiglitz-Greenwald theorem argues that not the first and second welfare theorem drive where economics is going. It's not that markets tend to produce efficient outcomes. It's that markets fail all the time, 120 different cases. So they state the 120 cases. People respond with conceptual clarity. They say, no, and there's no way to divide. How more robust would we be as an argument if we could show that despite all of the assumptions that they have, people are irrational, all right, there's asymmetric information, there's imperfect market structures, and yet nevertheless we can show that the market can provide the solution. That's the challenge that Rosolino and I have tried to take on board. It's not new to us. There's a whole bunch of people that have done it. And so in our book, the next part of the book is devoted to the change the rules, which is Buchanan and Coase. Coase on the legal arrangements, Buchanan on the political arrangements. If, again, in the economic way of thinking, in the chapter having to do with externalities, the argument there is a pure Coasean one, right? We negotiate away conflicts, right? If we can't negotiate away the conflicts, what we're going to do is we're going to adjudicate to clarify rights in order to negotiate away the conflicts, right? We're not adjudicating to clarify, to eliminate the conflict. We're adjudicating to empower economic actors to negotiate away their conflicts. Similarly, if I have to rely on legislation, it's to legislate in order to clarify what needs to be adjudicated so that agents can eliminate the conflict through negotiation. They can internalize the externality through the price system. So the argument is that, what you think is a market failure, those 120 market failures, when you study them, it turns out that it's a institution failure. The institutions are not clarifying and defending the property rights. The institutions are distorting the price system. The institutions are blunting the profit and loss system. And so we want to identify the failure with the institutional dysfunction, and institutional dysfunctions require institutional revision. Again, why are some countries rich and other countries poor? It's not because of the people. It's because of the institutions under which they live. So the analytical idea of this institutional thrust is what's called Platt's fundamental equation of economics and our political economy. And it says as follows: I'm going to freeze preferences. People are just people. I'm going to explain the variation in the outcomes not by variation in people, but by variation of the rules under which people interact with nature and with each other. And so that's going to be my analytical focus. Note how that brings us back to Hume Smith, but for the 21st century. So change the rules. There's a great little book by Stephen Littlechild when he worked in the Thatcher administration trying to talk about regulatory reform in Great Britain. And it's called that, Change the Rules Okay. The reason why Great Britain was suffering from the economic malaise that it had suffered from, which led to the Thatcher, was they had bad rules. Not bad people, bad rules. Why did the United States suffer from stagflation and the economic malaise? Right now, the Winter Olympics are going on, right? Coolest thing in the world, right? Great. And right before the Olympics, they released a new movie or documentary on the 1980 U.S. Olympic hockey team that beat the Soviet Union. The college kids beat the Soviet Union. If you see the movie Miracle, it starts with the U.S. being in a complete malaise. Right? It's Jimmy Carter's last year in office. We're suffering from stagflation. The economy is flatlined. I became an economist because of my experience with that. I worked digging pools, and I was in charge of siphoning the gasoline. Has anyone here ever siphoned gasoline? It's a terrible thing to do. You stick a tube into another car and you suck on it, and then once you get it going, then you can put it in the other one. I was the youngest guy on the crew, so they made me do it all the time. I hated it. I spent an entire summer hating my job. I went to school. I learned, a bunch of things, one of which was why it is that they had the shortages. It was from my economics professor, Hans Senholz. It was like, boom, I went from sitting in the back of the room with a baseball hat to the front row on complete rapt attention. So change the rules. Okay. But there's even a more robust answer to that, which is the entrepreneurial solution. Markets fail, use the market to fix the failure. Markets constantly are imperfect. Entrepreneurs are in the process of perfecting them constantly. Again, think of those underlying variables and induced variables. Taste, technology, and pattern resource ownership. All right. Then what you have is taste, technology, and resource availability, prices, profit and loss, and pattern resource ownership. Every single time that the induced variables are not aligned with the underlying variables, there's a profit opportunity for the person to act on it. One man's waste is another man's profit opportunity. This is how you get innovation. This is how you get technological progress. The ability to grasp those profits, to recognize them, to act on them, to seize them. Okay? And then what happens, as Hayek puts it in the use of knowledge of society, if person A doesn't recognize it, person B will jump in to do it. So you need to have that open market competition. What does that lead to? Well, it leads to stressing the necessity for constant price adjustments in our understanding of how markets work. Markets work through the agitation of changing preferences, innovations in technology, shifts in resource availability. That motivates the market to constantly shift its profit-seeking activity. The market responds constantly to that. It leads to adaptations, adjustments, and innovations. And it provides a half-life for previous public policy justifications for regulation. What was once a justification now ceases to exist as a justification because the innovation has eliminated the problem that previously was thought of. So, used to be an issue of free riding problem. When we introduced our turnpikes in the United States, it was during the age of the horse and buggy. And what would happen is people would take their horse and buggy and go off track and go around the toll booth. Free ride. Okay? What did that mean for the toll road company? Right? It's going to go out of business because people are not paying the fee. They addressed that with state ownership of the toll roads rather than private ownership. But how about today? This is a wild idea, right? You could privatize all roads. Why? Because now we have these transponders, and you stick a transponder on a car. And so it's easy to catch the cheaters because they don't have the transponder. And so all you have to do is weed out the cheaters on the road. Much lower transaction costs today. And you can pay a user fee. You don't have to pay a fixed fee. Why? Because of technology. Used to be a commons problem. What happens when I innovate with barbed wire? Now all of a sudden I can't have fugitive resources, right? That's the whole point about the commons problem. In the overgrazing, you have fugitive resources. You know, the cows can go from that land to this land, or, you know, the fish, salmon can go from this salmon farm to that salmon farm. How do I police them? Well, how about the cows? And I develop private property plots and develop barbed wire. Now all of a sudden I have internalized the externality. So I don't have the externality anymore that justified the policy before. Markets fail, use the market to fix the failure. And so our argument, or what we're hoping to argue at the end, is this issue having to do with the more robust presentation of price theory as an answer to the criticisms of the market that are laid out in the standard market failure 120 cases. So thank you for your attention.